Welcome to the deep dive. So, you sent us a really interesting bunch of materials this time, all centered around developmental psychology.
Yeah, definitely.
I thought we'd, sift through it, pull out the really fascinating bits, the useful stuff, without maybe getting too bogged down in the super academic jargon.
Exactly. And it's a great set of sources. It really explores how we develop across our whole lifespan.
Right.
So our mission kind of for this deep dive is to get a handle on the core of it all. What drives these changes? What are the big ideas from thinkers like Piaget, Wallin, Vygotsky, Brunner?
Yeah, big names.
And also, how do researchers actually study this? It's pretty complex. Hopefully we can build a solid foundation. Maybe you offer a few of those, aha moments.
It's funny, isn't it? Whenever psychology comes up, people always have questions like, is my toddler's tantrum normal?
Oh, yeah. Every time.
My niece seems way ahead here, but maybe behind there. It just shows how relevant this stuff is day to day.
Totally. And the really interesting part, I think, is that developmental psych isn't just about, listing stages, ticking off milestones.
No.
It aims deeper. It tries to explain the why, the mechanisms behind the changes we see.
Okay, so let's get into those mechanisms then. What are the main forces shaping us?
Well, the sources you sent really hammer home this constant interplay. It's between what we're born with, genetics, biological growth, maturation, and the world around us, our environment, our experiences.
Nature and nurture.
Exactly. They're always interacting, always influencing each other.
Can you give us an example? How do those internal biological factors work?
Okay, think about a baby's brain in the first few months. It's incredible. There's this massive explosion of new connections forming between brain cells. That's synaptogenesis.
Right.
And this seems largely driven by our genetic blueprint. Almost regardless of the specifics of the very early environment, it happens across the brain.
Wow, so loads of connections are made initially.
Far more than we actually end up needing. And that's where the environment nurture starts to play a huge role.
Okay, so what happens to the extras?
Well, the connections that get used a lot, the ones that are important for the baby interacting with the world, they get stronger.
Makes sense.
And the ones that aren't used much, they gradually weaken and eventually get eliminated. That's called synaptic pruning.
Pruning, like trimming a tree.
Exactly like that. And this pruning goes on for years, even into adolescence in areas like the frontal lobes, which handle complex thought. So it really shows how our experiences literally shape our brain structure, building on that genetic foundation.
That's a really powerful image. Nature gives the raw material, nurture sculpts it. Now, one source mentioned a twin study by Arnold Gesell about stair climbing.
Ah, yes, Gesell study. Classic.
What did that show about maturation?
Well, it was clever. He used identical twins. They share almost identical genes, right? So similarities often point to maturation, differences maybe to environment. In this study, one twin got specific training on climbing stairs. The other got none.
And did the training help?
Initially, yes, the trained twin was a bit better. But here's the kicker. Just a couple of weeks later, the untrained twin, when given the chance, caught up really fast. Almost instantly, with no special instruction.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. It strongly suggested that for some basic motor skills, the kind that are kind of biologically programmed, maturation is key. Trying to rush it with early training might not make a lasting difference. Nature has its own timetable.
That really highlights that internal biological clock idea. But then the sources also talk about John B. Watson, who was pretty much the opposite view, wasn't he? All about the environment.
Oh, completely. Watson was a huge proponent of environmental determinism. He basically argued that our environment is pretty much everything in shaping who we become.
He was the one who thought you could mold any child into anything.
That's him. He was convinced that with the right conditioning, you could shape a child's destiny.
And he did that little Albert experiment, which feels pretty iffy by today's ethical standards.
Definitely iffy today. But yeah, the goal was to show fears could be learned through conditioning.
Remind us how it works.
Okay, so they had this baby, Albert, about 11 months old. Initially, he wasn't scared of a white rat that was the neutral stimulus.
Right.
Then they introduced a loud, scary noise, the unconditioned stimulus, which naturally made Albert afraid.
Okay.
They started pairing the rat with the loud noise. Show the rat, bang the noise, repeat.
And Albert started getting scared of the rat.
Exactly. After a few pairings, just seeing the white rat, which was harmless before, made Albert cry and try to get away. The rat became a conditioned stimulus, triggering a learned fear response.
Wow. That's a clear demonstration of learned emotion.
Yeah.
And it really fueled his belief in the environment's power.
Yeah.
He had that really strong quote, didn't he?
He did. Super famous, super controversial. Give me a dozen healthy infants, and my own specified world, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select.
Doctor, lawyer, beggarman, thief.
Regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. A really bold, extreme claim about environmental control.
It really is. And his parenting advice was, well, let's just say detached.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. He advised treating kids objectively, almost like little adults, minimizing physical affection.
Like a handshake in the morning.
A handshake, maybe a brief kiss on the forehead at night. No hugs, no kisses, no sitting on laps. He thought that stuff created unhealthy emotional dependencies, advocated for tender firmness.
Sounds pretty cold compared to modern ideas.
Very different. It flowed directly from his belief in conditioning and avoiding what he saw as unhelpful emotional entanglement. Your sources also briefly mention B.F. Skinner, right, with often conditioning rewards, punishments shaping behavior. Another angle on learning.
Right. So we have a Gay cell on maturation, Watson on environment. It seems like the field now sees it as much more of a mix, a complex interaction.
Definitely. That's the modern view. It's rarely just one or the other.
Okay, let's pivot to some of the big theories. Jean Piaget. You can't talk child development without Piaget. What was his main focus?
Piaget was fundamentally interested in how thinking develops, how intelligence evolves. Not just what we know, the very structure of our understanding changes as we grow.
Okay.
And what's interesting, initially at least, he wasn't so focused on why one child is different from another. He was looking for the universal mechanisms, the common path we all take in cognitive development.
So studying his own kids wasn't just about them specifically.
Exactly. He used those detailed observations to try and uncover general patterns in how knowledge itself evolves. He called it studying the epistemic subject, the universal knower, you could say, rather than just individual psychology.
And the core concept in his theory is schemes, right? What are those?
Think of schemes as like mental blueprints, organized patterns of thought or action we use to make sense of the world, basic units of knowledge. The sources highlight a few key things about them. One, they get more complex with practice, like a baby's grasp a reflex becomes a skilled grasping scheme.
Right.
Two, they're transferable. You can adapt your grasp to different objects. Three, they become more numerous as we develop, from simple reflexes to complex mental operations later on, like problem solving.
So these are our mental tools for understanding. How do they change? How do we develop new ones?
Piaget said it happens through two key processes, assimilation and accommodation.
Okay.
Assimilation is like trying to fit new experiences into the schemes we already have. So a kid with a dog scheme, 4 legs, furry, barks, might see a cat and call it doggy. They're assimilating it into their existing box.
Try to make it fit.
Right. But then accommodation comes in. That's when we have to change our existing schemes or maybe create new ones because the new information just doesn't fit.
So realizing the cat is different, maybe meows instead of bark.
Exactly. The child then has to accommodate that new information. Maybe they refine their dog scheme or they create a whole new cat scheme.
So assimilation is fitting in, accommodation is changing to fit.
Precisely. And Piaget stressed they always work together. It's this constant back and forth trying to make sense, using what we know, adjusting our knowledge when needed, that pushes cognitive development forward. It leads to better adaptation, a state of balance he called equilibrium, that a drive for balance is key.
Got it. Now, Piaget's famous for his stages. Let's start at the beginning. The sensor-motor stage. Birth to about 18 months.
Yep. Sensoromotor. The name says it all, learning through senses and motor actions. Touching, tasting, seeing, hearing, grasping, moving.
Practical intelligence.
Totally practical, action-based intelligence. And one of the huge achievements here is developing object permanence.
The idea that things still exist even when you can't see them.
Exactly, that's a massive. They also develop basic ideas about space, time, cause and effect, all learned through their own actions. And they gradually move away from pure egocentrism, thinking everything revolves around them, towards understanding the world exists separately.
How did Piaget actually test for object permanence? Those experiments are pretty famous.
He did simple but brilliant things, like show a baby a cool toy, then cover it with a cloth while they're watching.
Now what happened?
Younger infants, say, before about 8 months, often just lose interest. If they can't see it, it's like it doesn't exist. They usually don't search for it.
Out of sight, literally out of mind.
Pretty much. But then, around 8 to 12 months, they start lifting the cloth to find it. Progress. But even then, it's not fully baked. He showed this with the A not B error. You hide the toy at place A, baby finds it, then right in front of them you move it and hide it at place B.
And they look.
They often still look back at place A, even though they just saw it go into B.
Why do they do that?
Piaget thought it showed their understanding was still tied to their own previous action of finding it at A. It wasn't yet a fully independent concept of the object's location. It's like a semi-permanence.
Fascinating. Searching where they found it, not where they saw it go.
Exactly. It's a step along the way. By around 18 months, usually they get it. Objects exist independently. They have locations, even if hidden.
And this full object permanence is tied to what he called the group of displacements. It sounds complicated.
It does sound technical. Basically, it refers to the underlying mental structure that lets the infant understand objects are permanent and can move around in space predictably, even when hidden. It's the mental framework that supports understanding the permanent object.
Okay. And then quickly, the later stages, pre-operational and concrete operational.
Sure. Pre-operational, roughly 2 to 7 years. Big leap here is symbolic thought language, pretend play. But thinking is still often illogical, very egocentric, hard to see things from others' points of view.
Right.
Then concrete operational, maybe 7 to 11. Logical thinking emerges, but it's still tied to concrete physical things they can see or manipulate. The huge achievement here is conservation.
The conservation tasks, like with the water in different glasses.
The classic. Show a child 2 identical glasses, same amount of water. Pour one into a tall, thin glass. Ask if they're still the same amount.
And pre-operational kids say the tall glass has more.
Often, yes. They focus on the height, the appearance. They can't mentally reverse the action or consider both height and width. Concrete operational kids get it. They understand the amount hasn't changed. One source even mentioned a kid explaining it using pistons and liquid, showing they grasp volume constancy.
That developing logic about the physical world is really something. The sources also had some of Piaget's own observations, like Laurent and the paper cutter, Lucien and the blanket. What do those add?
They give you a real feel for sensor-motor intelligence in action. You see Laurent exploring the paper cutter with his existing schemes, sucking, grasping, learning its properties through trial and error.
Figuring it out, hands-on.
Exactly. And watching Lucien with the blanket and doll, you see object permanence developing gradually, including those A not B type errors in a real-world setting. It brings the concepts to life.
And there were also the conservation tasks with clay, changing the shape of a clay ball.
Right, similar idea.
Yeah.
Ball of clay, roll it into a sausage. Is it the same amount of clay?
And kids go through stages with that too.
Yeah, Piaget saw 3 levels. Non-conservation. The sausage has more, it's longer. Then a transitional level. Sometimes they get it, sometimes not. Explanations are shaky. Finally, conservation. It's the same amount, and they can explain why. It's the same clay identity, or you can roll it back, reversibility, or it's longer but thinner. Compensation. The sources had a quote from a child named Bon giving that identity argument.
That shift from being fooled by looks to understanding the underlying reality is key. He also looked at conservation of movement. That sounds tricky.
Yeah, that was about understanding inertia, basically. A ball rolling after being launched by a spring. Would kids understand it keeps going unless stopped by friction or air resistance?
How do they do?
Younger kids really struggled. Explanations were often not very physical or logical. Older kids started considering factors like weight, but still imperfectly. It was usually adolescents who could grasp the abstract ideas, thinking about friction, air resistance, even imagining a frictionless world.
Shows how scientific thinking develops, from intuitive ideas to more abstract, accurate ones. Okay, let's switch gears. Harry Wallen. His theory seems broader, bringing in personality, emotions, social stuff more.
Yes, exactly. Wallen focused on personality development, and he really stressed the inseparable link between the biological and the social. Development as a journey from being primarily organic to becoming psychic and social.
And he thought human infants are especially dependent socially.
Yes, because of our complex starting point, he argued we rely heavily on our social environment for a long time. And for Wallen, emotions and social interaction are absolutely fundamental right from the start.
The infant's first way to connect and get needs met.
Absolutely. He saw emotions as the first language. A cry isn't just noise, it's a signal demanding a social response. These early emotional dialogues, he believed, are the bedrock of psychological development. The very first stage is dominated by affectivity.
Wallen also talked about imitation differently, didn't he? Made a distinction.
He did. He distinguished between immediate imitation, copying something right away, which he saw as more of a motor thing, and deferred imitation.
Copying something later.
Yeah, copying something you saw earlier. For Wallen, that was a big deal. It showed the child could form a mental representation, hold on to it, and reproduce it later. That signifies emerging symbolic thought.
Interesting. And he had these terms, centrifugal and centripetal stages.
Right. Wallen saw development as less linear, more like an oscillation. Centrifugal stages are when the child's focus is directed outward, exploring the world, interacting with others.
Okay.
Centripetal stages are when the focus turns inward, consolidating the sense of self, integrating experiences. So development isn't just adding skills, it's this rhythm of outward exploration and inward consolidation.
More like a dance than a straight line. And he had his own stages too.
Yes, focused on personality. Starting with that emotional stage, moving into a sensoromotor and projective stage, exploring through movement, developing language, connecting thought to action. Then later stages, like adolescence, which he also saw as a time of crisis and transformation, developing abstract thought, but with a big emphasis on the social and emotional reshaping involved.
So compared to Piaget's focus on cognitive structures, Wallen seems more holistic, integrating emotion, social factors right alongside cognition.
That's a great way to put it. Piaget's lens was primarily cognitive logic. Wallen offered a broader view, always emphasizing the interplay of biological, social, emotional, and cognitive factors.
Okay, now let's bring in Vygotsky and Brunner. Their sociocultural theories really put the emphasis on society and culture, right? How did they differ from Piaget?
It's a really significant shift. Piaget saw the child mostly as an independent scientist exploring the physical world. Vygotsky, however, argued that development is fundamentally social. Our higher cognitive functions, language, reasoning, memory, they actually originate in our interactions with other people, and then we internalize them.
So learning happens between people first.
Exactly. It's embedded in social interaction and shaped by the tools our culture provides. Very different from Piaget's individual discovery model or the behaviorists focused just on the environment acting on the child. For Vygotsky, culture actively shapes the mind.
He talked about psychological tools. What did he mean by that?
Think of them as culturally created systems that help us think and control our behavior. Like physical tools help us manipulate the world. Psychological tools help us manage our minds.
Examples.
Language is the big one. But also writing, number systems, maps, diagrams, mnemonic techniques, any symbolic system provided by culture that mediates our thinking.
So language isn't just for talking to others, it becomes a tool for our own thinking.
Precisely. Vygotsky really stressed that. We learn these tools through interaction with more knowledgeable others, adults, peers, and that leads us nicely to Brunner.
Right. Brunner built on Vygotsky with the Language Acquisition Support System, the LASS.
Yes. So if Chomsky talked about an innate language acquisition device, LAD, Brunner focused on the environmental counterpart, the LASS.
The support system.
Exactly. Brunner argued that adults create structured, supportive environments, routines, interactions that essentially scaffold language learning for the child. It helps them figure out how language works communicatively within their culture even before they fully grasp the grammar. It's both social and linguistic support.
And he had specific terms for these interactions, interaction formats.
Yeah.
Tutoring relationship.
That's right. Interaction formats or routines are those early, predictable, back-and-forth exchanges between caregivers and infants. Think games, feeding routines. They happen before much language.
Like peekaboo.
Peekaboo is the classic example. Later, as language develops, you get tutoring relationships, where adults more explicitly guide learning. And both are underpinned by scaffolding.
Scaffolding. Like providing temporary support.
Exactly. The adult helps the child do something they can't quite manage alone, then gradually withdraws that help as the child gets better.
What are the key features of those early interaction formats, like peekaboo?
Two main things the sources mention. Repetition, they happen over and over, creating predictability and contingency. What one person does depends on what the other just did. It's a reciprocal flow.
Makes sense. Predictable but interactive.
And adults often subtly vary the routine, right? Introduce little changes within the familiar structure to keep it engaging and push development gently. Different faces in peekaboo, hiding slightly differently.
The sources had that detailed example, Richard and his mother playing a labeling game. What does that illustrate?
It's a fantastic example of LASS in action. You see the mother actively structuring the interaction. At first, she treats even his babbles like potential words. Brunner called that acting on the semanticity hypothesis.
Assuming he means something.
Right. Then she gets more demanding, prompts him, "What's that?" Pushes for a better approximation of the word.
She's scaffolding.
Totally. And as he starts using real words, she adjusts again. Maybe uses a tone like, come on, I know you know this one. She raises the stakes, pushing him towards more mature communication.
And Richard learns not just words, but how the communication game works.
Exactly. He learns communicative intentions, turn-taking, all within the supportive format the mother creates and adapts as he grows. She might accept pointing at first, but later demands the word. It's a dynamic teaching and learning process.
These sociocultural ideas really highlight how much learning is embedded in relationships and culture. A really valuable perspective alongside Piaget's internal focus. Okay, last big section. How do researchers actually study all this stuff? What methods do they use?
Well, like any science, it starts with the scientific method, asking questions, testing them systematically. A fundamental choice is the research design. Longitudinal or cross-sectional.
Okay, break those down again. Longitudinal is?
Following the same group of people over a long time, measuring them repeatedly, you see how individuals actually change.
Like a movie of their development. And cross-sectional.
Studying different age groups all at one point in time. Compare the 5-year-olds to the 8-year-olds to the 11-year-olds, for instance.
A snapshot across ages.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons?
Longitudinal is great for tracking individual change, but it takes ages, costs a lot, and people drop out.
Right. Attrition.
Cross-sectional is much quicker, you get bigger samples, but you don't see individual development. And differences might be cohort effects, like maybe 11-year-olds today are different from 11-year-olds 20 years ago just because the world changed, not just because of age itself.
Gotcha. Cohort effects. The sources mention mixed designs too.
Yeah, trying to combine the strengths, maybe follow several age cohorts over a shorter period, get some individual tracking and cross-age comparison.
Makes sense. What about experiments in developmental psych?
Still crucial for cause and effect. You manipulate an independent variable, something you think causes a change, like a teaching method, and measure the effect on a dependent variable, the outcome, like test scores.
And you have to control everything else.
Exactly. Control extraneous variables. The sources mention techniques like standardization, keeping procedures identical for everyone, balancing groups on key characteristics, counterbalancing task order, and crucially, random assignment, randomly putting participants into different conditions, for example, different teaching methods, to make the groups equivalent initially.
Okay. The sources also mentioned crossed and nested variables. Sounds statistical.
It is a bit, but the idea is simple. Crossed variables mean you look at all combinations, like studying age, young gold, and instruction type, visual verbal. You'd have all 4 groups, young visual, young verbal, old visual, old verbal. Nested variables mean one variable exists only within levels of another. The example was eye color and exam discipline. Eye color is nested within the student. Each student has one eye color. But all students take exams in multiple disciplines, so discipline is crossed with student eye color. It just affects how you analyze the data.
Right, okay. Now, observation seems key in developmental, and it's evolved quite a bit.
Hugely. Started with those early baby biographies, often quite subjective. Then Gossell was a pioneer with systematic observation, using film, creating developmental norms, really meticulous recording.
And now?
Now it's often very systematic, hypothesis-driven. Researchers develop detailed coding schemes, precise definitions of behaviors they're looking for. They use video, audio, often in controlled settings, though naturalistic observation in homes, schools is still vital too.
Coding schemes. So you define exactly what counts as, say, sharing or aggression.
Precisely. And then you need sampler methods, like do you record every single time the behavior happens, event sampling, or only observe during specific intervals, time sampling? The sources also mention questionnaires common for getting parent reports, attitudes, etc.
Right. And standardized tests, intelligence tests, things like that.
Yep, very common. Started with things like the Binet-Simon scale leading to the IQ score, first as a ratio, mental age, chronological age, later as a standardized score comparing you to your age group.
Which is more common now.
Yes, the standard IQ. And newer tests, like the KABC mentioned, try to focus more on the cognitive processes involved in problem solving, not just the final score. And tests are often used as dependent variables in research, like assessing cognitive outcomes for premature infants.
And finally, the Piagetian clinical method. That sounds different again.
It is. It's less standardized, more flexible. Piaget would give a child a task, like the conservation problems, and then interview them, asking follow-up questions, probing their reasoning.
Trying to understand how they think, not just if they're right or wrong.
Exactly. The focus is on the underlying logic, the cognitive structure. The sources had examples showing how the interviewer explores the child's explanations for conservation, or lack thereof. For Piaget, the level of thinking was more important than just the child's age.
It's really about the quality of reasoning.
Yes. And similar qualitative, interpretive approaches are needed for things like understanding Wallen's emotional stages by observing interactions, or for Vygotsky and Bruner's detailed analysis of those parent-child interaction formats, looking for those patterns of repetition and contingency.
It's quite a toolbox of methods they have, isn't it? From big quantitative studies tracking hundreds of kids to deep dives into one child's thinking or one interaction.
Absolutely. And often the best understanding comes from combining these methods, getting different angles on the complex process of development.
Well, this has been quite the journey through developmental psychology. We've hit nature-nurture, the big theories Piaget, Wallen, Vygotsky, Bruner, and the methods they use. It definitely gives you a framework for thinking about kids and maybe even ourselves.
It really does. Understanding these core ideas offers, I think, valuable perspectives for parents, teachers, anyone interested in how we grow and learn.
So for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into the sources you shared sparks some thoughts. Maybe think about the implications of these theories for education or parenting or just understanding your own path. Were there any aha moments connecting back to the materials you sent?
Yeah, and if a particular theorist or topic really grabbed you, definitely dig deeper, maybe even send us more sources for another time.
Until then, keep observing that amazing journey of development. Thanks for exploring the depths with us.